Somebody is asking, you're Palestinian, obviously. Did you know about the massacre in Hebron of 1929? Nope, never heard of it? Of Jews. It was Muslims killed Jews. Nope. Okay. Does he know that in Hebron in 1929, the Muslims massacred Jews?
هل عندك علم بمذبحة 1929 لما المسلمين ذبحوا أو قتلوا اليهود؟ No, I do not know.
Do you know that in Hebron there was a massacre in 1929? Do you know about that?
No, I don't know about that.
No, you don't.
1929?
1929. Massacre of Jews. Muslims killed Jews.
No, I don't know about
Okay. They never taught about it. Nothing.
that. I've never heard about it.
Okay.
Unfortunately. Sorry.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 11 of this Ziontology series. Just to recap, over the past several episodes I've looked at how Zionist efforts to acquire land in Palestine led to the dispossession of its indigenous inhabitants, and that, combined with loud declarations of how they would take over the country, led to riots in the years 1920 and 21. The biggest of these, the Jaffa riots, took place in May 1921 and left 95 people, 48 Palestinians and 47 Jews, dead. There was further violence on the 2nd of November that year, the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. A small riot initiated by Palestinians left 8 people dead, 5 Jews and 3 Arabs. After this, things quietened down, and Palestine would see over 7 years pass without any major outbreaks of violence. Jewish immigration continued through the 1920s and is divided into waves known as the Third and Fourth Aliyah. Various factors caused immigration to both increase and decrease at different times. The vast pogroms, in which anywhere between 100,000 and 250,000 Jews were murdered in Eastern Europe, came to an end with the conclusion of the Russian Civil War. The Soviets, in contrast to the Romanov dynasty, condemned anti-Semitism and forbade the distribution of any propaganda that would incite ethnically based hatred. At the same time, synagogues were seized by the Russian state and religious teaching prohibited as part of a wider drive to stamp out any form of spirituality. After the First World War, most Jews leaving Europe headed to the United States. This became more difficult after the US government introduced immigration restrictions in 1921, which were further tightened in 1924. This all but removed the United States as an option for Jews leaving Europe. Although the implementation of these restrictions was not influenced by Zionists, they were essential to the success of the movement. During the mid-1920s, Polish Jews came in large numbers due to economic policies in that country that hammered the middle classes. Due to this immigration, the Jewish population in Palestine grew disproportionately to the Arab one. In 1918, there were approximately 60,000 Jews and just under 700,000 Arabs in Palestine, making Jews slightly less than 10% of the population. By the British census of 1931, there were 175,000 Jews and about 880,000 Arabs, meaning that Jews now constituted 20%. Immigration wasn't consistent year by year. In 1927, 2,000 more Jews actually left Palestine than arrived due to a severe economic downturn. Throughout the decade, 4 out of every 1,000 of the world's Jews came to Palestine, and of them, 1 in 4 returned home. The British did not give the Zionist movement what it really wanted, free immigration, as they would then have had to do the same for the Arabs. Instead, a quota system was devised which heavily favoured Jews. It is also the case that, while Zionists didn't want the British imposing restrictions on immigration, they were well aware of their limited capacity to absorb immigrants. There was also a jockeying for power between different Zionist groups, as they recognised that power would be held by the nationalist group with the greatest numbers. Zionists also selected immigrants based not on their suffering in the pogroms, but on what they could contribute to the colonisation of Palestine. The Zionist executive demanded that visas were given only to those, quote, elements who will not be a burden to us, those elements who will build the country, end quote. Referring to the pogroms, one Labour leader wrote, quote, we are obligated to be cruel. We must restrain ourselves and declare that though the killings continue, we must save the Yishuv and its future because the fate of all our people depends on it." End quote. Historian Tom Segev points out that this is again the idea that Jews must serve Zionism and not the other way round. The Zionist acquisition of Arab land, as described in episode 5, carried on throughout the 1920s. The British ultimately attempted to outlaw evictions of Arab tenant farmers, but there were always loopholes, such as landlords evicting tenants prior to the sale. In one instance, farmers threw stones at Jews who came, under the protection of the British police, to requisition land. One of the Jews shot and killed an Arab, in an incident the newspaper Haaretz described as regrettable. The Zionist executive spoke out against the carrying of firearms in such instances. I mention this as it is interesting that in the 1920s, the killing of one Arab drew this kind of attention. It makes you realise just how far we've come. The tension over labour continued, with Jewish farmers being pressured not to employ Arabs. Arabs also did not make a habit of employing Jews, although I'm not clear if this was for racial reasons or because Jewish labour was just more expensive. The British Mandate government attempted to set up a proto-legislature, ostensibly as a first step to self-government. This failed because the Arabs wanted a direct democracy that reflected their numerical weight, whereas the Zionists wanted parity of power between Jews and Arabs, at least until they were in the majority. Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann is quoted as saying that the democratic principle does not take into account the fact that there is a fundamental qualitative difference between Jew and Arab. End quote. In 1922, a delegation of Palestinian leaders met with Winston Churchill and formally rejected the Balfour Declaration, demanding independence. There were some conciliatory moves from Jews to Arabs during the 1920s too, however cynically or otherwise they may be taken. In 1927, an earthquake struck Palestine, killing 250 Arabs and destroying many of their homes. The residents of Tel Aviv sent truckloads of bread, and the Zionist movement contributed £100,000 to the Government Reconstruction Fund. It is also during the 1920s that the idealistic Jewish peace movement, Brit Shalom, was founded. It rejected the typical Zionist attitude of achieving dominance over the Arabs and advocated for a unitary Jewish-Arab state. Founding member Arthur Ruppin wrote, quote, "In the foundations of Brit Shalom, one of the determining factors was that the Zionist aim had no equal example in history. The aim is to bring the Jews as second nation into a country which is already settled as a nation, and fulfill this through peaceful means. History has seen much penetration by one nation into a strange land only by conquest, but it has never occurred that a nation will freely agree that another nation should come and demand full equality of rights and national autonomy at its side. The uniqueness of this case prevents it being, in my opinion, dealt with in conventional political legal terms. It requires special contemplation and study. Brit Shalom should be the forum in which the problem is discussed and investigated." End quote. Militant Zionists such as Vladimir Jabotinsky would have taken this as nonsense. And maybe he was right, but it's certainly a preferable option to what ended up happening. By the end of the 1920s, you could be forgiven for thinking Palestine's darkest days were in the past, with no major outbursts of violence for over 7 straight years. That would be a mistake, however. Vincent Sheean was an international correspondent who travelled to Palestine in the late 1920s. By his own admission, he was something of a philo-Semite, and initially positive about the Zionist project. That positivity faded away, however, upon arriving in Palestine and seeing the delusional absurdity of the Zionist position. Quote, "In 3 weeks I have already acquired serious misgivings about the wisdom of the Zionist policy. I still knew nothing about the Arabs of Palestine, but I could see them all around me everywhere. And if my long experience in political journalism has taught me anything, it was that one people did not like being dominated or interfered with in its own home by another. These things seemed to me plain, beyond argument. What I wanted to hear was what the Zionists were doing. Their comments on the Arabs took a form that seemed to me invariably stupid. in Palestine or elsewhere, the form of underrating the opponent. Your ordinary Zionist would say, in so many words, "We do not have to worry about the Arabs. They'll do anything for money." I knew no Palestine Arabs, but unless they were far different from the Arabs I had known in Morocco, Iraq, and Persia, this could not be the truth. End quote. What started the 1929 Palestine riots could be said to be a case of the straw that breaks the camel's back. The camel may already be loaded up with many heavy stones, but strangely, it's often something comparatively minor that is, well, the final straw. In Palestine, the many heavy stones were the wider Zionist incursion, the British occupation, the Arabs being driven off their land and denied employment, the many subtle indignities that came with all of this. The straw was a series of incidents at the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem is the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. It is also the site of the Western Wall, a part of the Second Temple and the most holy place in Judaism. You can see what the problem's going to be here. Vincent Sheean writes about how the Al-Aqsa Mosque was much less jealously guarded than other Islamic holy sites he'd visited. Quote, "It would be quite within the facts to say that the mosque, in spite of the religious traditions that made it one of the three holiest spots of Islam, was treated as a public monument, like St. Peter's in Rome, or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. As long as one took one's shoes off, it was all right to spend day after day in the place, and even to photograph it." End quote. The only rigidly enforced restriction was that Jews were prohibited from bringing any structures to the wall. This included things like chairs or screens. Sheean writes that, quote, "The Muslim refusal to permit innovations was clearly based upon the fear that, if they did so, the Jews would soon have a synagogue at the wall of the mosque." End quote. Religious Jews would not enter the Temple Mount complex for fear that they may unknowingly step on the place the Holy of Holies had been. Zionists, on the other hand, were largely absent of such religious sentiment, and had no such objections to visiting. Muslims initially did not object to them doing so. Sheean writes about Zionists taking an interest in the Western Wall for two reasons. Firstly, quote, "If they could get absolute possession of the area, they could count on the adherence of a large number of religious Jews who had always been cold to the movement." End quote. Secondly, there was a sense in which the wall did have a religious significance to them, just not within the religion of Judaism, but rather to the court of Zionism. Sheean writes, quote, "The Arabs, for whom they had contempt as an uncivilized race, to whom some of them referred to as Red Indians and others as savages, were in possession of a place that signified a great deal to the Jewish world in general. The fact hurt the pride of all Jews, I believe, but oddly enough it was the young agnostics and unbelievers who were the most bitterly offended and expressed themselves most loudly. What appeared in everyday talk in Jerusalem was what the Jewish Chronicle in London summed up with admirable precision. The wall had come to be regarded as a gauge of Jewish prestige in Palestine." End quote. Zionists distributed provocative literature, showing a Jewish flag on top of the Dome of the Rock. I guess this could be comparable to Muslims distributing images of St. Paul's Cathedral being turned into a mosque. That's probably not the best comparison, however, as in the West, politics has largely replaced Christianity as a religion, so it would be more comparable to images depicting the Houses of Parliament or Congress as Islamic structures. This would, of course, be interpreted as a clear sign of intent for Islamic imperial dominance. The Palestinians paid attention to this and further distributed the images. The Muslim Supreme Council issued a statement reading, "Having realized by bitter experience the unlimited, greedy aspirations of the Jews in this respect, Muslims believe that the Jews' aim is to take possession of the Mosque of Al-Aqsa gradually on the pretense that it is the temple." End quote. Jewish worshippers went from being tolerated to now regularly attacked and having stones thrown at them. In September 1928, Jews erected a cloth screen to divide men and women praying on Yom Kippur. This might have been an innocent action, and in the past, such temporary violations of rules have been tolerated. In an atmosphere of heightened tensions, however, Muslims immediately complained to the British authorities. After the Jewish worshippers failed to remove the screen in a timely fashion, the police destroyed it and violence erupted. Arabs cheered the police on, shouting, "Death to the Jewish dogs." The Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, organised a construction project next to the wall and had the Islamic Court of Prayer performed right next to where the Jews were praying. On the Zionist side, our friend from episode 9, Vladimir Zevi Jabotinsky, ran a long campaign claiming Jewish rights over the Western Wall, going as far for calling for insubordination and violence. Tom Segev claims that both men were cynically using the issue to raise their status within their own communities. In August of 1929, 6,000 Zionists, many from Jabotinsky's revisionist movement, marched to the Temple Mount, shouting, "The wall is ours." They waved Zionist flags and sang their anthem. Rumours spread in the Arab community that the Jews had been armed with metal bars and had attacked Arab residents. The later British inquiry found that the march had been peaceful and participants unarmed. The following day, Palestinians counter-demonstrated. Presumably believing the rumours of Jewish violence, they burnt Jewish prayer books and other religious iconography. Insightful articles appeared in Arab media, calling on Muslims to, quote, "Hearts are in turmoil because of these barbaric deeds, and the people began to break out in shouts of war, jihad, rebellion. O Arab nation, the eyes of your brothers in Palestine are upon you, and they awaken your religious feelings and national zealotry to rise up against the enemy who violated the honour of Islam and raped the women and murdered widows and babies." End quote. The Jewish newspaper Dor Hayom, of which Jabotinsky was the editor, also published inflammatory material. This was not approved of across the Zionist community, with Haaretz publishing an article reading, quote, "He who sows the wind shall reap the whirlwind." The poison of propaganda was dripping from its columns daily until it poisoned the atmosphere and brought about the Thursday demonstration, and this served as a pretext to the wild demonstration of the Arabs. End quote. Jerusalem was a tinderbox, waiting for the right incident to set it off. That came the following day. I've come across various accounts of the incident I'm about to describe, and I'm going to go through the narrative of the most common one. Some Jewish boys kicked a football onto a Palestinian's tomato patch, where it was picked up by a little girl. The boys went to get the ball back, and the girl hid it under her clothing. When they tried to take it off her, she screamed and adults came running. What presumably should have stopped there now escalated into one of the Jewish boys having his head cracked open by an iron bar and dying several days later. Now, what sounds like a childish misunderstanding had become a tragedy. Whilst it again should have stopped there, a Jewish mob now set fire to Palestinian dwellings, attacked residents, and selected a boy at random to be stabbed in retaliation. Violent incidents escalated over the following days. Then, thousands of Muslim Arabs from surrounding villages streamed into Jerusalem armed with knives and sticks. They were motivated by a belief that the Zionists were going to take over the Temple Mount. In unknown circumstances, 2 Arabs were killed, and a massacre of Jews ensued. There are far too many violent incidents to go through each one, so I will just describe the Hebron Massacre, which for many reasons captured the worst of it. The Jews in Hebron were mostly not recent Zionist immigrants. In fact, the Sephardic community there was believed to have roots going back 800 years. After the riots, the Jews of Hebron wrote a letter to the British High Commissioner describing what had happened to them. Begin quote. 68-year-old Rabbi Maya Castell and 70-year-old Rabbi Zivi Drabkin, along with 5 young men, had been castrated. Baker Noah Immerman had been burnt to death with a kerosene stove. The mob had killed pharmacist Benzivi Gershon, a cripple who had served Jews and Arabs for 40 years. They had raped and killed his daughter as well. Yitzhak Abu Hannah, 70 years old, had been tied to a door and tortured until he died. 2-year-old Mention Segal had his head torn off. End quote. In his book One Palestine Complete, Tom Segev describes the fate of the Maklev family. Quote, "While the atrocities were taking place in Hebron, several Arabs from the village of Colonia attacked the Maklev family in their home in Motzah, a Jewish village just outside Jerusalem. They murdered the father, mother, and their son and 2 daughters, as well as 2 guests staying in the house. After the murders, they looted the house and set it on fire. Only one son, Mordecai, was saved. Years later, he became chief of the staff of the Israeli army. End quote. I'll return to the Maklev family in a moment. It is also the case that Arabs put their lives on the line to shelter Jews in their homes. To quote Tom Segev again, "Most of Hebron's Jews were saved because Arabs hid them in their homes. The community confirmed this, writing, 'Had it not been for a few Arab families, not a Jewish soul would have remained in Hebron.' The Zionist archives preserves lists of Hebron Jews who were saved by Arabs. One list contains 435 names. Over 2/3 of the community, then, found refuge in 28 Arab homes, some of which took in dozens of Jews. Arabs were hurt defending their neighbours," one Jew testified afterwards. Dr. Abdul Al, an Egyptian doctor, received a letter of gratitude from Colonel Kish for the assistance he rendered the Jews of Hebron, in addition to the care he gave the wounded. He himself protected an entire family. End quote. Whilst Hebron was the biggest slaughter, with 67 Jews being murdered, it was no means an isolated incident. Many Jewish communities were attacked, with some being completely destroyed. In total, 133 Jewish people were murdered. 116 Arabs were also killed, mostly by British soldiers suppressing the riots. Some innocent Arabs were murdered by Jews in revenge attacks, with reports of lynchings. One Jewish police officer entered an Arab home and attempted to kill the entire family. He succeeded with the adults, but only managed to wound the children. Some Jews also protected Arabs from lynch mobs, with one account of a Jewish woman saving an Arab man by taking him into her house and disguising him in her husband's clothes. After the riots, Zionist publications described the Arabs as bandits, Oriental savages, and murderers, with Dr. Moshe Bellingson writing that, quote, "You cannot build a lasting house designed as a shelter for a whole people on a volcano." End quote. The British responded to the riots with a series of commissions. The Shaw Commission sought to establish the cause of the riots, and the Hope Simpson Commission looked more specifically into the issue of Arab dispossession. I've quoted from both previously, so I'll just recap the gist of Shaw's conclusions here. Begin quote. "Between 1921 and 1929, there were large sales of land, in consequence of which numbers of Arabs were evicted without the provision of other land for their occupation. The position is now acute. There is no alternative land to which persons evicted can remove. In consequence, a landless and disconnected class is being created. Such a class is a potential danger to the country. The fundamental cause, which in our opinion disturbances either would not have occurred or would have been little more than a local riot, is the Arab feeling of animosity and hostility towards the Jews consequent upon the disappointment of their political and national aspirations and fear for their economic future. The feeling as it exists today is based on the twofold fear of the Arabs that by Jewish immigration and land purchases they may be deprived of their livelihood and in time pass under the political domination of the Jews." End quote. The British government then issued the Passfield White Paper, which advocated limiting Jewish immigration and restricting land sales. Zionist organizations mounted a successful political campaign to it, which concluded with Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald issuing his own letter retracting all restrictions. This is known as the MacDonald Letter, but the Arabs labelled it the Black Letter. This brings us to the 1930s, where obviously the fate of European Jews is about to drastically change, and the fate of Palestine along with them. I'll conclude by talking a little bit about why these riots in particular are so important in the history of Palestine, and in the shaping of Zionism. As the clip at the beginning of this episode indicates, Palestinians either do not know about the Hebron Massacre today, or see the 1929 riots as just one part of a wider struggle against colonialist invaders. By contrast, historian Hillel Cohen refers to 1929 as Year Zero of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Indeed, that's the title of his book on the subject. He goes so far as to state that it is impossible to understand Jewish-Arab relations in the land of Israel-Palestine without understanding the events of 1929. This isn't because it is the starting point, but because the violence forced all Jews in Palestine to come together. Prior to that point, Middle Eastern Jews probably had more in common culturally with Muslim and Christian Arabs than they did with European Jews who did not share their conservative values. They may have also resented the Zionist project, seeing it as causing trouble for them. As Muslim Arabs did not distinguish in their attacks, but rather lumped all Jews together, Palestinian Jews now had to look to the Zionists for protection. Arab violence therefore succeeded where Zionist efforts had failed, in creating a collective Jewish identity in Palestine. 1929 has one further substantial bearing on future events. It raised the acceptable level of violence. The generation of Jewish boys who lived through it would go on 20 years later to be the men who ethnically cleansed Palestine of 750,000 of its non-Jewish population. Famous massacres, such as the one committed by Zionist forces at the village of Deir Yassin, were justified by the events of 1929, when men from Deir Yassin were said to have enacted violence against Jews. A moment ago I quoted Tom Segev describing the massacre of the Maklev family. Mordecai Maklev was a 6-year-old boy when he witnessed his family slaughtered during the riots. He went on to become Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces. In that role, he established the infamous Unit 101, led by Ariel Sharon, and responsible for indiscriminate massacres of Palestinian civilians during the 1950s. Maklev had watched his mother die in agony after being repeatedly stabbed. Thanks for listening. Just a quick note, I have edited the transcripts of the first 10 episodes and turned them into a book, a standalone book, and also a guide to the podcast series, which is fully footnoted. So every claim I made in the first 10 episodes there's a reference for available in that document. The book is available on my website and I will link to it below. Thank you.